Thank you all for coming. I want to start by acknowledging the incredibly generous supporters of this exhibition, the Chauncey and Marion D. McCormick Foundation and Ann L. Kaplan. We are also indebted to Dirk Dennison Architects and our in-kind sponsors who helped summon the spirit of the Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles here to Chicago with a stunning architectural curtain wall in the galleries. David had debuted Interval excuse me, with the help of LAX Art and the Graham Foundation in a former flower shop in the Bonaventure earlier this year. Tonight, we are joined by Canadian-born artist David Hartt, who received his BFA from the University of Ottawa and his MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 1994. This audience may recall his 2011 project, Straylight, a film installation that provided an intimate look at the Johnson Publishing Company offices just before they vacated them in 2010. That exhibition debuted at the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Chicago, and then traveled to the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Henry Art Gallery, and the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. Most recently, David has been working and exhibiting far and wide. Making Interval took him to the far reaches of the world, to subarctic Sakhalin Island in Russia and Whitehorse, Canada, while other recent projects were shot in Detroit, Michigan, Athens, Greece, and the island nation of Tuvalu. His work has been exhibited at the newly reopened Whitney Museum of American Art, the Orr Gallery in Vancouver, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver. And later this year, he will be featured in the Museum of Modern Art's New Photography 2015. After living in Chicago for many years and teaching at both SAIC and Bard College, David moved to Philadelphia earlier this year, where he was appointed assistant professor of fine arts at the University of Pennsylvania. And while we couldn't be more happy for him, his presence here is already missed. We cannot thank you enough, David, for coming and collaborating on this project with us and for conceiving of this installation for our galleries. So please welcome David Hartt.
Thank you so much, Becca and Judith. It's a real privilege to be here. Just make sure that yeah, there we go. It's a really huge privilege to be here, and interestingly, my first ever public talk was actually here on this stage 5 years ago. I was invited to participate in the Society for Contemporary Art series. And it was on the eve of my debut museum exhibition, Straylight, at the MCA. So it's really kind of lovely. I had just moved back to Chicago at that point, and having just left, I feel as though the Art Institute has really, provided the perfect kind of bookend in terms of my experience here. So thank you so much. So the presentation that I'm going to share with you is prepared. I'll read and show some slides, and then some film clips as well. And hopefully there'll be room for questions at the end. So I want to start by saying that my current practice is the product of a 7-year hiatus from making work. From 1994 until 1998, I had a fairly typical postgraduate experience. I made work and showed regularly, and then life gained the upper hand. I went back to making work again in 2005 with the desire to differentiate my practice from my prior approach and create a way of working that was both deliberate and sustainable. I'll move quickly through some of this earlier work, which began in 2005. It's most important to me in that it sets up a trajectory of interests and a methodology for research and production. All of these earlier images are, unless otherwise noted, 48 by 60 inches with a 6-inch white border. They're either Cremura or archival pigment prints mounted to die bond and framed. Each work is didactically titled based on the name and location of the site. For example, Classroom at Stonechild College, Rocky Boys Reservation, Montana 1. Or the previous images, Greenhouse used by Earthworks, Detroit Agricultural Network, and Growing Healthy Kids, Earthworks Urban Farm, Detroit, Michigan, and Urban Farm at the Catherine Ferguson Academy for Pregnant and Parenting Teens, Detroit, Michigan. At the root of my practice, there is a level of biographical inquiry. I was adopted and raised in an Anglo middle-class Protestant suburb of Montreal. Both of my parents are white Jewish academics, and as a result, I interpret the locus of culture as a fluid aggregate construct. Snake Butte, Fort Belknap Reservation, Montana. Lebel Poussin writes in African Nomadic Architecture, to understand nomadic boundaries, we need to think of the built environment and its spaces in the context of movement. The movement of people, the movement of one's world of material culture. Movement, however, is also an essential part of our cognitive experience. For the nomad, home cannot be understood except in terms of journey, just as space is defined by movement. As our reference points change, so too does our point of view. Music room at the Farm School, the Farm, Summertown, Tennessee. In Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities, he interrogates the values of truth and opinion and how society organizes ideas. I love his concept of the hovering life, a synthesis of the mythic and the factual. Inoculation room at Mushroom People, the Farm, Summertown, Tennessee. From the outset, I tried to find an open-ended conceptual framework that allowed for a variety of engagements, a series of nodes within a broad interconnected continuum. Some nodes then branch off and subdivide with a greater complexity than others. Looking back at my notes, I found this statement written in 2005, although I didn't show the resultant work until 2008. Develop a system of image making threaded by twin impulses. One, the romantic tradition of picturing the world, the other, an examination of forces affecting that world. I made a list of possible sites. Pavilion, Folly, Hermitage, Belvedere Platform, Precinct, Station, Classroom, Library, School of Thought, Office, Conference Room, Headquarters, Company Town, Club, Sanctuary, Food Bank, Garden, Greenhouse, and Nursery, Commune, Refugee Camp, Special Economic Zone, Garden City, Silicon Valley, Rust Belt, Reserve, Reservation, Institute Complex, Union, Think Tank, Foundation. Local 1, Chicago, 55 West Van Buren Street, Chicago, Illinois. The idea was to create a spectrum of ideologically differentiated sites. And in fact, because I'm interested in the site's conceptual value, I'm never sure of its potential to yield something of visual interest. Musil describes thought as a weightless, tasteless, odorless substance, and perhaps that's the best way to describe the ideological residue of a site. I'm interested in the specificity of a place. What narratives and ideologies does it reveal? How do the personal and the public commingle? What individual traces contribute to or detract from the overall manifestation of an ideal? Marginal Way Skate Park, Seattle, Washington 1. David Hartt, a member of the French architecture firm Périfique, writes in Customized Review of Peripheral Architecture in 2002. We find ourselves with pieces of cities, bits of urban utopias of sorts, that don't work, but that have become real in turn because life has gained the upper hand and we have to make do. Making do is a very powerful idea, not the notion of settling for less, but the concept of creating a unique vernacular response to a changing social, economic, environmental, and cultural conditions. The films and photographs function as an intimate portrait of dreams and ideals that have not failed as much as been subtly displaced or altered. Reference area at the Bartholomew County Library, Columbus, Indiana. The works are a distillation of my subjective experience. When they are successful, they challenge my ability to assimilate them into my visual lexicon. I like them best when they're slow-moving and awkward, the cinematic equivalent of a wildebeest. Ultimately, I consider my work an opportunity to dimensionalize my experience of the world and my place in it. So these are installation photographs of Straylight. This venue is the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle. Straylight is a film installation and suite of photographs typically shown in a two-gallery configuration. The first has an array of images selected from the suite and acts as an antechamber for the film installation in the second gallery. This is an installation shot from the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. Standing sentinel-like, framed in the doorway to the second space, the viewer encounters a sculpture acting as an establishing shot. Its elements are precisely made of thick slabs of water jet cut painted aluminum and acrylic. This is a full shot of the installation in Chicago. Once in the room, the other elements reveal themselves. A video soundtrack loop projected to cover entirely one wall. The floor of the room is carpeted in a custom-made archival pattern specific to the location of where the film was shot. Archive at the Johnson Publishing Company headquarters, Chicago, Illinois. The subject of Straylight is the headquarters of the Johnson Publishing Company, JPC. The building was designed in 1971 by John Mutasani, an African-American partner in the firm Dubin Black. It was purpose-built for JPC and their portfolio of businesses. It is 11 stories tall and an iconic presence on South Michigan Avenue in Chicago, with its illuminated ebony jet marquee on the top of the building. The incredibly preserved interior of the building was executed by Arthur Elrod and is a clear, exuberant expression of the founders John and Eunice Johnson's taste. Resolutely modern, colorful, layered, and complex. Awards room at the Johnson Publishing Company headquarters, Chicago, Illinois. JPC is singular in that it is both a register of the post-war Black experience as well as a media instrument that shapes and defines a very clear aesthetic, philosophical, political, and economic vision. Kiosk at the Johnson Publishing Company headquarters, Chicago, Illinois. The title references the monochrome nature of some of JPC titles, including jet, ebony, and historically tan, hue, and black stars. It also addresses an inflection point in the history of the company, with the collapse of the publishing industry and an increasingly hybridized culture. Lounge at the Johnson Publishing Company headquarters, Chicago, Illinois. The score for Straylight was composed by Nicole Mitchell. Significantly, Nicole was the first female president of the AACM, an institution famous for its association with musicians like Henry Threadgill and the Art Ensemble of Chicago, preeminent voices in avant-garde music at the time of the building's construction. And the exhibition that's currently up at the MCA, in fact, the Freedom Principle, celebrates the legacy of the AACM and its relationship to Chicago and to contemporary art. Test kitchen at the Johnson Publishing Company headquarters, Chicago, Illinois. Straylight technically in an optical system, it's light that wasn't intended in the design, that limits how dark the system can be and thereby how accurate a reading it can provide. And for me, operationally, it's a wandering itinerant approach that allows participation, the kind of participation that can change the rules because it brings a variant point of view and generates a different reading. So I'm going to play a clip from Straylight right now. Belvedere. Cubicles at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, Midland, Michigan. Belvedere is a group of photographs and the title of my most recent book, published by Dominica in New Documents. It will also be on view this fall at MoMA as part of the new photography exhibition, Ocean of Images. The text was written by Berlin-based architectural theorist Marcus Meeson. The subject of the work is the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, a conservative free market think tank and the originators of the Overton window. Fiscal Policy Cubicle at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, Midland. The title stems from the desire to relate the architectural folly, the Belvedere, to a public policy tool, the Overton window. Specifically, I was interested in the Renaissance practice of using an architectural device to frame and order the natural environment. This framing and the resulting aestheticization effectively suggest a value proposition. What is in the frame is worth considering and beautiful. What lies outside the frame is worthless and ugly. Publications at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, Midland. The principle of the Overton window is to shift radical policy to actionable policy. Functionally, it works by suggesting the extreme, so the less extreme seems reasonable in comparison. Healthcare overflow files at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, Midland, Michigan. When engaging a site, one of the things that excites me and interests me is the difference between the ideological potential of a site and how the space actually defines itself. That gap between one's experience of the space and one's knowledge of the activities that actually go on there. What's amazing about the physical structure of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy is its ruthless efficiency. It's the cockroach of architecture. Highly adaptable and entirely lacking in affect, a clean room for ideas. Joseph P. Overton Memorial Library at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, Midland, Michigan. What's considered is how certain historical ideologies have become ordered, commodified, and instrumentalized, occasionally even weaponized, as they're selected and brought forward. Mutable, responsive, and networked, the center acts as a clearinghouse for strategies, collecting, developing, articulating, and then distributing specific responses to given social and economic conditions. For everyone, a garden. I'd like to show a triptych from a body of work that I produced in 2013 entitled For Everyone a Garden. It established a more provisional approach for me that was a necessary corollary to the rigidity of both Straylight and Belvedere. It also allowed for a more speculative engagement with my subjects. This is the left panel. The work addresses the promise of modernism and its institutions, which still very much define the fabric of the contemporary neoliberal city. Moshe Safdie's 1974 book lent its title to the exhibition, and the architect Jean-Louis Chanayak, his juxtaposable cells of 1962 provided the basic form that ran overtly and covertly throughout. The drawings are based on digital collages that I had made and then provided to an illustrator who works for Marvel Comics. They're rendered as 2 5-by-7-foot photographic enlargements framed with colored film applied to the acrylic glazing. And actually, this work is in the collection of the Art Institute. And this is a detail of the right panel. And can everybody read it, or would you like me to read it aloud?
Read it out loud.
Yeah. The spontaneous acts of revolt forming everywhere must find a tactic that takes into account the spectacle's power of recuperation. And it's actually a quote that I found from Guy Debord. Jason E. Smith writes in a recent issue of Grey Room, to speak, however, of the contemporary relevance of Debord's films, the question is simple. Why Debord filmmaker today? Is to assume in advance that one has at hand a usable definition of the contemporary. Art historical debates often cast about for defining dates or events, some opting for the global student and worker revolts of 1968, others the 1989 collapse of the Soviet bloc. One might also speak of 1973 as a pivotal hinge, dating as it does both the point when the energy summoned in the struggles and revolts of the late 1960s began to burn out, and the first signs of a capitalist restructuration, call it what you will, neoliberalism, post-Fordism, real subsumption, even a fully realized spectacle, emerged to define our own present up to and beyond the global crisis of 2007, 2008. The Republic. And this is an installation shot from David Nolan Gallery from 2014. The Republic is a representation of the speculative present. As a point of departure, it imagines the proposed city plans of a Greek urban planner, Konstantinos Doxiadis, for both Athens and Detroit. Doxiadis' The Capital of Greece project began in earnest in 1955, was intended to bring some order to the explosive post-war growth and urbanization that Athens was experiencing. In 1965, he was commissioned by Detroit Edison to lead the Developing Urban Detroit Area Research Project as a component of the growing Great Lakes megapolis region. At the heart of his consultancy was the UNIVAC Doxiadis Associates Computer Center, one of the largest and most technologically advanced in Europe. And this piece is titled Fragment. Neither commission was realized due to the changing social and political conditions. The fall of the military junta in 1974 and the Detroit riots of 1967 changed the historical trajectory of both cities. What's compelling is Doxiadis' involvement at critical turning points in both histories. What's exposed are the cracks in the firmament that perhaps led to their current status. Another point of reference is the architect, urban planner, and developer John Portman, hired to imagine another future for Detroit. He was commissioned by Henry Ford II and a consortium of civic leaders and investors to bring to the Midwest some of the innovations that he had deployed in Atlanta. His proposal was the Renaissance Center from 1977, an insular withdrawn solution to the elements of disinvestment, mismanagement, and depopulation that had plagued the city. The Republic, too. Both Athens and Detroit embody to some extent the failures of late capitalism in the neoliberal state. They are fraught in complex relationships with the concept of ruin. But the Republic doesn't dwell on this. Instead, it imagines the reality of their shared citizenry, moments that are grand and occasionally languid, provisional yet full of hubris, congested, frustrated, and shot through with random acts of callous violence, but lastly, with the burden of history, their perseverance is transcendent. The Republic 4. The exhibition references the cinematic history of the late 60s and early 70s, borrowing liberally from Debord's The Society of the Spectacle, Godard's Sympathy for the Devil, and Marker's Le Fond de l'air est rouge and Sans Soleil. The concept of the film essay is annexed and spatialized. The Republic 3. The exhibition involves various elements whose relationship suggests a loose constellation. Central is the film The Republic, shot in both Athens and Detroit. The footage is montage so that the locations become indiscernible, and a hybrid city-state emerges. Musician Sam Prekop composed the score and plays the role of the engineer, both performing and tweaking the city's parameters, how fast the traffic flows, how brightly the power grid burns. Interspersed at random moments throughout the film is a group of laborers who flip an automobile in a winter landscape as both an invocation of the myth of Sisyphus and a reenactment of civil disorder. In the gallery, sculptural forms derived from the architecture of John Portman create a public stage for viewing and discussion. Full-scale cast bronze acanthus plants sprout from the floor, hovering in a state between nature and monument. On the wall is a photograph of a cat who has begun to disappear under the glare of sodium vapor lamps, a witness whose constant surveillance is testimony of a state that never blinks. I'll play a clip from The Republic now. Interval. Interval is a new body of work that I premiered last March in Los Angeles. It's currently up in a vastly different form here at the Art Institute, and I want to take a moment to thank Chicago-based, as Becca already did, Chicago-based Dirk Dennison Architects, and from his office, Michael Flath and Michelle Simoni, for helping me realize the transition of this work from LA to Chicago. Interval is a film installation and a suite of photographs comprised of source material from 2 locations. The first is Whitehorse in the Yukon, and it's the subject of a white paper entitled The Squatters of Whitehorse by anthropologist and geographer James Lotz, a protagonist in Glenn Gould's 1967 radio work, The Idea of North. He makes passing reference to the document in the work's narrative. The white paper records the living conditions and habits of various individuals living in specific settlements around Whitehorse, from itinerant laborers involved in resource extraction to members of the Métis and First Nations community. This is an installation shot from the Bonaventure. It's Suite 201A, an abandoned florist. The second location is Sakhalin Island, geographically part of the Japanese archipelago, but Russian territory. Sakhalin was the former penal colony, or rather was a former penal colony, and the subject of Anton Chekhov's only work of nonfiction, The Island, A Journey to Sakhalin. Historically, the island has been contested territory, and its contemporary population is indicative of the territorial struggles, with a diverse population ranging from Russians, Japanese, and Koreans to an indigenous population of Gilyak and Ainu. Chekhov's book is a rigorous examination of the conditions and habits of the island's 19th century inhabitants. My interest in using these 2 locations has as much to do with Gould and Chekhov as it does with each site's conceptual potential as a marginal geography with a singularly focused economy. Both figures, who were at the height of their respective careers, found it necessary to find subjects on the periphery of their individual societies in order to find the critical distance to comment on the center. Chekhov and Gould are both central to the cultural heritage of their individual nations, and the 2 cited works have become iconic in defining a sense of cultural identity. Additionally, interval is a term in music, the simplest kind of chord, or the shared harmonic result of 2 notes struck simultaneously. It also refers to temporal and spatial displacement. Rem Koolhaas writes in Junk Space, "There are no walls, only partitions, shimmering membranes, frequently covered in mirror or gold." The work was initially commissioned by LAX Art as part of their occasional project. I chose to cite the piece in a former flower shop at an icon of postmodernism, the Bonaventure Hotel. The building was designed again by John Portman and completed in 1976. The site not only references the history of Southern Californian architecture and the post-Fordist landscape that Los Angeles embodies, this deliberate siting attempts to annex the possibilities of architecture in a potentially post-ideological time. Frederick Jameson writes in his essay, The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, the Bonaventure aspires to being a total space, a complete world, a kind of miniature city. To this new total space, meanwhile, corresponds a new collective practice, a new mode in which individuals move and congregate, something like the practice of a new and historically original kind of hypercrowd. Jameson acknowledges the emergence of a new cultural and environmental archetype. The structure is emblematic of the emergence of the 3rd stage of capitalism, the postmodern or the multinational. And even though he calls for a new form of artistic practice in cognitive mapping, he fails to acknowledge the emergence of a 3rd kind, beings whose hybrid ethnography and experience of the world is as deracinated as the spaces they inhabit, virtually or otherwise. Perhaps this is the new dream of Constant, a global nomadic population imprinting new narrative possibilities with every encounter, a permanent dérive. Both Rem Koolhaas in Junk Space and later Hal Foster in his symbiotic text Running Room assume some of the same insights and prejudices present in Jameson's text. It prioritizes a late capitalist understanding of architecture's potential and its prevailing neoliberal narrative. Hal Foster writes in Running Room, in fact, junk space describes a stage of modernization whose energies no longer project forward into time, but fall back entropically into space. If, as Koolhaus suggests, that we're living in times in which architecture is no longer motivated by an ideological imperative, but is instead a pure instrument of capital, what does this mean to formerly marginalized communities, regardless of their physical location, and their ability to assert themselves within a global narrative? And this is an exterior of the building. It's not a work of art. Well, it is a work of art, but in a very different way, and I didn't author it. The strategy of traveling to the periphery in order to understand the pathologies of the center has to do with more than just adopting the methodologies of Gould and Chekhov. Perhaps the work addresses a new condition of constant hybridity, a prototypical hyperspace. It also has to do with our current understanding of a decentralized global culture, the redistribution of wealth and power, and a poetic analysis of two communities who, as a result of the flow of global capital, are in the process of active myth-making and re-territorialization. And I'll play a short clip from the film, which, I mean, you could obviously go outside and see, but I think what's interesting in this case here is that you'll actually see both channels side by side, so you'll be able to see what's going on. If you experience the film in the galleries, you only see one channel at a time. So you actually see here how I've interwoven the different narratives and how they come together and then drift apart. Adrift. The last body of work I'll share with you is Adrift, a film installation that consists of a 16mm looped projection along with provisional seating. My work to date has dealt with the relationship with ideology in the built environment. Adrift addresses the concept of what happens to an ideological perspective and belief system when the environment that it was developed to respond to and defined by disappears. Specifically, I'm interested in the changing concept of sovereignty in the 21st century, both virtual and physical. The film is a work of speculative fiction set 50 or so years in the future. The entire population of the island nation of Tuvalu has been forced to relocate due to rising water levels, a result of global warming. The Tuvalese have commissioned a high-density, Solari-esque arcology built on the banks of the Mississippi River. The story references aspects of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn and Kobo Abe's Inner Ice Age 4, as the main character, Sinai's journey traces a territory of uncertainty, uncertain identities, economies, and borders. It considers the impossibility of someone living in our present to understand the moral and cultural conditions of someone from the distant future. Abe writes in his postscript to Inner Ice Age 4, "I must understand the future not as something to be judged, but something rather that sits in judgment of the present." These are installation shots from Ore Gallery in Vancouver. The story is centered around the developing relationship between the two central characters, Sinai, a young Tuvalese woman, and Noah, a young American man. The characters appear in voiceover through our eavesdropping on mobile device conversations. We see a new transformed world through Sinai's eyes as she wanders through first the vast halls of the arcology and then the tropical landscape of a future Missouri. Media broadcasts occasionally intrude, and we're given expository information that describes a community in crisis. The Tuvalese have developed a halobacteria as a desalination process to treat the elevated salinity of the Mississippi River. The river's flow has been reversed due to rising water levels in the Gulf of Mexico. The halobacteria, however, is mutated from a salt dependency towards a reliance on silicon dioxide, a key chemical component in glass and fiber optics. The halobacteria then begins to eat the architecture of the settlement, forcing the U.S. to create a quarantine zone around the community. The result is a de facto sovereignty for this refugee state, as the Americans try to contain the pathogen that could decimate their communications infrastructure. When Sinai decides to leave, we follow her journey up the Mississippi to be united with Noah. I shot the footage in Tuvalu, which appears in the film as the Mississippi River Settlement and Quarantine Zone. Bertrand Goldberg's River City complex in Chicago appears as the Tuvalese arcology, and models from the Art Institute's Goldberg archive of unbuilt phases of the River City complex appear as the exteriors of the Tuvalese arcology. Besides the literary references, the work also picks up on some of the themes introduced in the earlier work For Everyone a Garden. Adrift experiments with how outmoded ideological positions are retrofitted to provide a provisional response to the changing conditions of contemporary society. The stasis of utopia and the progressive agenda of modernism are specifically under siege. Its architecture, economies, and the very concept of the nation-state have now achieved the status of ruin. So I'm going to show two clips because it's a narrative. I found that it was hard to get a sense of the story by just isolating one clip. So there's actually two short clips that I'll play.
Okay, nickname for the river. You first.
Old Blue. The Big Muddy.
The gathering of waters.
Old Man River.
Father of waters.
Big River.
You said that one. I didn't. We brought the tropics. We brought the salt.
What building are you in?
Tower 3, 709. There's only a few families left on our floor, though. There's a lady, Mrs. Tavalli, across here. And then my cousin, Maletta, and her husband, Wow.
Were you born then?
My parents moved to New Middleman around March or April 64. I was born in May.
What's your family like?
My father works hard. He's got 3 jobs. My mom works in a data center with me. They lost everything during relocation. I guess they're pretty happy considering.
I'd be happy if I was with you too.
Why so many questions?
You're fascinating.
So that first clip is from the beginning of the film, and the second clip I'm going to play is about 2/3 of the way through the film, after Sinai has left the arcology and is traveling up the Mississippi.
I'm hungry. I wonder what they're cooking. It smells so good. We're worried about you. I'm fine. Tell everyone I'm okay. There's a house on top of an American property with satellite TV. I'm praying for God's protection. I have to go.
.TV Data Services, the private Tuvaluan hosting provider, was charged with trafficking stolen government property by the U.S. Justice Department. According to an indictment filed yesterday in federal court, .TV helped distribute classified information from the U.S. Army. The case is part of an ongoing crackdown on offshore data havens. There is debate about whether the U.S. has jurisdiction over the company. .TV plans to fight the charges, arguing that their privacy practices are legal under Tuvaluan law. Although technically American soil, the halobacteria crisis is blurring the lines between U.S. and Tuvaluan territory.
I'm sorry about earlier.
It's okay. I'm just happy to hear your voice.
I love you so much.
Me too.
Were you able to get the
I
drive?
can't wait to see you. Tonight.
Thank you.